Hey everyone, welcome back to the Valor Flight Crew Podcast. Today, we are diving into something that is at the core of every successful air medical mission, the relationship between the pilots and the medical crew. We had the chance to sit down with two very well-esteemed pilots, Gene Reynolds and Matt Johnson, for a really great conversation about communication, teamwork, and the behind-the-scenes dynamics that keep our crews safe and efficient. We'll talk about everything from pre-flight briefings and sterile cockpit rules to a fit-for-shift mindset and how staying sharp and engaged makes a difference for everyone on board. We'll also get into some of the challenges that pilots face, like managing equipment, weights, and weather conditions, and that balance between medical needs and aircraft limitations. So, whether you're on the flight line, in the back of the aircraft, or just curious about how all the pieces come together, this is a great topic for us to dissect. Let's dive in. We'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, Precision Aviation Group, Spectrum Aeromed, Vertical Valor Magazine.
Welcome to the Valor Flight Crew Podcast, brought to you by Vertical Helicasts and Vertical Valor Magazine. Produced in partnership with Echo, Every Coast Helicopter Operations, the Valor Flight Crew Podcast promotes the personnel and life-saving equipment behind helicopter air ambulance services. Join hosts Mike Fideli and Blake Schreider for in-depth interviews and expert insights from air medical personnel, pilots, communication specialists, and maintenance crews who play critical roles in airborne emergency response.
Line 1 accepting.
Copy, Line 1, gotcha, accepting. You're going to be talking to Red Feather 1 on LCEMS.
Most of us are in this industry because we like to think of it as a service. We're providing a service to the patient, but the reality is that at the end of the day, that this is still, there is a very large business component to it. And so there's always the pressures coming from the business side of things to, have, better operating aircraft, to have smaller aircraft that cost less, that aren't as expensive to maintain, but you offset that with the capabilities that you may have with those particular aircraft. And then you have the medical side of the house saying, well, we need this piece of equipment. We need this piece of equipment. We need to have a Lucas device. We need to be able to do ECMO. We need to, when you factor in all of the needs, you may as well just get a Chinook at that point, right? It's just, there's no way that's possible to really do all of the things that we want to do. But you need to find that happy medium, and it's got to take that buy-in from all parties, whether you're, a vendored program or whether you're a hospital-based program or somewhere in between. You have to have that buy-in of all parties present to be able to understand what your overall or your overarching mission is going to be and how you can support that.
So Matt, I have a question. Have you ever been approached by a clinical aspect or someone to say, hey, we're going to put Lucases on this aircraft. Matt, what do you think? Has anyone ever asked you that?
Kind of.
Okay.
But it's one of those situations where, there's going to be a equipment or, all these various committees, hospital room committees, right? And subcommittees and subcommittees of the subcommittees and so forth.
Yes.
So they're really good about that. They'll look at how much does a device weigh? Is it going to be compliant with our PED policy? Where, is it going to be able to be safely mounted and so forth? So they won't just show up with a new piece of equipment and say, we need to make this work. So I applaud them for that.
Good.
There are equipment changes all the time. And I think a lot of times it's, and I get it, coming, the background I had, you would rather have it and not use it, right? In case you need it, than to need it and it not be there. But let's face it, let's look at numbers. I mean, how often are you using a lot of that stuff? I'll give you a prime example. I'm curious, in the 429, are you guys flying two patients at once, Gene?
No.
Will you fly two patients?
No, we don't have the capability.
Yeah, we don't do that. We have that capability. You may have that capability in a 429 as well. And it's a kit that it spiders out and it has these harnesses and so forth. And it had some substantial weight to it. And we carried that for years when we got the 145s. And we were looking at trimming off some fat. And it's like, well, how many times have we actually used this second stretcher kit, the second patient kit?
Right.
0, right? Of course it exists that it could be, right? But when it come down to it and you have a legit conversation about it, it's like, and just like you guys have, major class Bs and class Cs, it's going to be a mass casualty event, right? At something like an airport or a bus or even something else. But regardless, you're probably going to know about it in time to where you can go retrieve that bag, that 20, 25 pound bag, and throw that on the aircraft if you're in the mindset and the mode of an MCI. So we had that discussion and we were able to eliminate that from our aircraft. And still to this day, knock on wood, I hope during my career we never have to. That means it's really bad, but it's sitting next to our balloon pump, next to our equipment. Whereas just like anything else, if a specialty flight comes in, then we go do this, we put this harness in and so forth. So I think a lot of times what I'm trying to say here in a roundabout way is there's a lot of unnecessary equipment, even by the clinical side's own admission sometimes.
I think that is such a great, like, I don't know why people think of it as like a taboo subject, right? I mean, because we collect so much data in this industry, right? We have so many numbers, and then it's like, well, what do we do with it, right? Like, we can't plan for every emergency, right? Yes, it's nice to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. However, if you could look at a trend that say, hey, for the last 12 years of us doing this, not one time have we needed it. Doesn't mean that we won't, but like you said, that most likely if it's something that comes up, we're probably going to know about it and we'll have some time to either acquire that piece of equipment or we'll know ahead of time, hey, we're probably going to need this. And I think that really is this next topic was like minimizing the unnecessary gear. It's not that it's unnecessary. It just might not be necessary for the 90% of your daily flights. But when you need it, you'll have that time to be able to retrieve it. And I wish people, and as this industry, we really took that into account. And it's okay that we can be practical with that because we have data, we have numbers that show that like it backs that up. We can use it. And if we do need it, we have time to retrieve it. So I really think that when we as an industry make these decisions, it should be all encompassing. We need that pilot's perspective. We need that input. We need the input from the med crew. Like, let's hear it from the business side. Let's hear it from the clinical side. Let's hear it from the doctors, but let's also get the pilots on board. Let's get everybody. So that way, at least it's all on the same page. And then that way you could make the best decision going forward.
Yeah, I think that's also a really good point, and kind of just, tailing on to that a little bit. Just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? And you have to look at a lot of different dynamics in that area. And we went through the same thing with the two patient. There was a handful of times in the past, almost 40 years that we had fly two patients. And, thinking back to recent years, I've been on scenes where we've had 4 and 5 aircraft scenes. Well, if we can get 4 and 5 aircraft to show up to an incident, there's really no need to worry about taking a second patient because we like to joke and say we have a helicopter in every corner, but know your resources available in that particular area. Right. And, if you can get 4 and 5 aircraft to show up, it's not safe for the patient to do 2 patients, and it's not safe for the crews to do 2 patients because of the processes involved. So let's cut out that aspect of it and recognize that, this is probably not needed. And it's a way that we can be able to have a means to an end by having something else that would be more beneficial for the crews to have in place.
I know we kind of started off, we were kind of talking about weather. And I know that's always a hot topic. But when it comes to the aircraft performance, right? Like where I'm at, the ambient air temperature, especially in late August, it's humid and it's hot. We fly at 135. We want to stuff a lot of stuff into the aircraft, right? And everybody, it's not like the movies. You don't just come in and you land straight in and straight out, right? That's just not the normal every day. Can you give us, Gene, like a perspective on like really how the ambient air temperature and how everything really affects that aircraft and that airframe's performance, and how much weight you have on board, how much that can either hurt or help that situation?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure that Matt can elaborate on it quite a bit more eloquently from a performance standpoint. I would probably say in my current area, we get a little bit lazy because we fly most of the time around sea level. And in my area, we don't do a lot of high altitude operations. It doesn't get very hot up here in the summertime. But some of our other locations in like Western Montana, Eastern Oregon, or Eastern Washington, some of our bases are routinely landing well up into the thousands of feet MSL up in the mountains. And so, yes, they have to, and they're in much smaller aircraft, more power limited. So they do have to pay attention to the performance planning issues with their aircraft. But absolutely, this does play a role, and the pilot has to be pretty keen on what the aircraft can and can't do from a performance standpoint. And when it gets to operating on the at the edge of the margin, there's not a whole lot of room for error. There's lots of techniques you can employ to kind of have that safety margin be a little bit bigger, just the way you're flying the machine. But I'll go back to my comment earlier. The organization I worked for we were very, very detailed in all of our performance planning because we were putting people in the mountains at 11, 12, 13, 14, 15,000 feet sometimes in Afghanistan. And literally we're managing weight by the pound. We're managing fuel by the minute. And if a customer misled us or showed up with an extra piece of equipment, we really had to stand our ground and say, this is what it's going to cost you, or this is how it's going to change the operation. And they quickly, once we kind of said, we can't take you to this landing zone, just can't do it, not with this weight or with this performance margin, because we had a lot of built-in safety margins. And then some of those we were allowed to eat into for certain conditions. But once we showed them that we were serious and then kind of showed them the effects of missing the mark or missing the calculation, it changed their mind quite a bit. And everyone bought into it and said, oh, this is important. You'll stand on the scale before you step on the ramp of the aircraft. And you'll write that number down, and then the pilot's got an accurate list of everything that's coming on board. And I think it's key that through flight training, through a pilot's career, they do learn a lot about power management, weight and balance, and how that affects. And then, of course, the environment, density, altitude, and things like that. So it absolutely is key. And I do think that being able to stress that to the crew and to passengers that come on board, or even just the organization as a whole, if hospitals are making decisions on what's going on board your aircraft, they probably should be educated on what some of the ramifications might be.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you say that, and it's not just temperature, but it's altitude locations as well. So when you're looking at flying in Colorado versus flying down in Florida, your performance characteristics are different in those aircraft. And, and I'm in Pennsylvania, we go by, a summer fuel load and a winter fuel load based off of, what our conditions are going to be outside. And I don't think people recognize, you think, oh, the aircraft is so big, it should be able to handle all of these things. Like, that's not necessarily the case. And it's all about that ratio. And I don't think that goes into a lot of consideration when.
Well, it gets even deeper than that. And I do think this is an important part. Both Matt and I fly complex twin engine IFR aircraft that are Category A certified. And not everyone understands what that really means. But it's not only just, can the aircraft do this on a day-to-day basis, but can the aircraft do what I'm asking it to do on one engine? Right. What happens when one engine stops working or producing power? And so there are a lot of, it's like we have our twin engine performance profiles and we have our single engine performance profiles, and we really have to adhere to both of those. And it can get quite complicated in the planning phase or just in understanding. If I take off in a half-mile visibility and I'm in the clouds right after departure, and then I lose an engine, can I still maintain the climb gradient that I need to not hit any obstacles on this departure procedure? And that's some of the additional, varsity level work or the education that our pilots have to go through and understand. Hey, it's not just, can the aircraft hover at 18,000 feet? Great, cool, great performance. The manufacturer sold the aircraft with these awesome numbers. But how do you apply that to everyday operations? If I'm departing from a very dense trauma center in downtown Seattle and I lose an engine on departure, am I going to survive this or am I not going to survive this? That's really, for twin engine aircraft at least. Single engine aircraft, they can have that. Doesn't say I'm not flying.
It's a whole
not
other
flying the
discussion
single ever
there.
again, but that's what it is.
But I think that's a big part of it that med crew don't necessarily understand, like, where your thought process is going in when you're making decisions to take flights or not, and in what conditions and what altitudes and what temperatures. And I think that there's so much that goes into making that process. A lot of it just comes natural to all of you as far as working through what you're, you can handle or not handle based off of the aircraft that you're in. But I don't think the med crews or the hospital crews or any of those people are recognizing that there's a lot more that goes into this decision-making process that you guys are going through for each and every flight.
Matt, do you have anything to add to that as well?
No, I think Gene hit a grand slam with that. I think that's great. That all makes sense and is crystal clear. Weight is so paramount. So as much as we can shave off, that buys us time. And when I say buys us time in the event of an OEI or one engine inoperative situation, we're talking fractions of a second. Little things like that can help. So the lighter, the better.
And I think that that's such a good point that you guys bring up, because, like I said, there's a lot of these things I'm just ignorant to, and it's not anything other than just maybe we've never talked about it, or we've never just really considered what you guys are having to go through when you accept the flight. It's more than just weather, it's more than just the location. It's exactly what you said. If I'm leaving this busy area and we do have an emergency, where are we going to go? How are you going to manipulate that aircraft? And Matt, like you just said, it's split seconds, fractions of a second to determine how you're going to handle that, and if we can survive it or if we can't. And I think that as med crews, we should really understand so much more how you guys make that decision. And if it's a no, we need to make sure that we're being respectful of that, to be like, it's more than just a weight issue, or that there's so many other things that come into play. And like you said earlier, 3 to go, 1 to say no, as cliche as that sounds, we need to hold to that. And I think that's such a really great perspective for us to know from what you guys are planning.
So talking a lot about this decision-making, I think kind of leads into the next, topic I really wanted to discuss with you guys today. And that's, talking about IFR missions and your thought process that goes into planning for those. I know you kind of talked about some of the emergencies that you may have, but IFR, I think, is its own separate animal. And I feel like there's a lot more that goes into that entire process, both on the pilot side and on the medical side, which is kind of another discussion portion that I want to have from it. But for those of our listeners that haven't really flown IFR, been privy to the thought process that goes into making an IFR decision, can you guys just kind of touch a little bit along what med crews can kind of expect that's going through your mind in the planning process? And then, we can kind of get into the flight process itself.
Stay ahead of the mission with Vertical Valor Magazine, the only publication dedicated exclusively to the military and public safety sectors of the rotorcraft industry. The Valor team travels around the globe to bring you stories from the rotorcraft industry's first responders, with a special focus on the knowledge and technology that furthers their missions. Learn more at verticalmag.com/valor.
You want to take that, Gene?
Where I'd be.
I know that's a loaded question, but
no, it is, and you're right. This could be an entire podcast if you wanted. Probably to start from the beginning, the first thing is to make sure med crew know that, yes, helicopters can fly in the clouds. Some of them may not realize that, or they are floating over from a different base, or they come from a program that was VFR only, or they've never flown fixed wing IFR, and all of a sudden they hop in this twin engine aircraft that's at an IFR base with an IFR pilot, and they look outside and it's gray and drizzly and raining, and all of a sudden they hear a pilot wants to accept a flight, and they go, "What? We can fly in this?" And you go, "Yes, we can." That's the first thing, like, hey, we can do this. And so the first few times for them, it might be uncomfortable. Like, they may be spatially disoriented. They may think that, I don't think this is right. I don't feel comfortable. And they really have this anxiety of, I don't understand this complex environment. So there's an education period that kind of has to happen, some orientation. The pilot has to have some ability to communicate, to assuage concerns, to kind of brief on the go, to kind of explain what's happening with the aircraft and why we're doing what we're doing. And a lot of that happens before the flight. So that your training program at your company has to kind of support that. The med crew members, when they're going to an IFR base, have to have some training ahead of time, just like the pilots do. So that's very, very key. And then once they accept and get past their fear of, okay, we can go in the clouds now, and we can do this from start to finish without ever seeing anything except runway lights. Then there's a technical education piece that has to happen of, okay, this is how they do it. It's how they do it safely. This is the challenges. These are some of the opportunities. It's an absolute game changer. We fly a lot of IFR. And it really, when you realize, hey, we can still move patients and get them to a higher level of care, even in bad weather conditions,
Right.
or non-VFR weather conditions. I don't want to use the word bad because it's not bad for flying.
Right.
But
Yeah.
once it's a real game changer. And so to be able to do it well is obviously an advantage to the communities that you serve.
Yeah, I think, for me, from the medical crew perspective, it was a very odd feeling flying IFR for the first time. I've been in airliners, and obviously it's a very different, process and feeling. But like, I think the biggest help for me was not only having that discussion ahead of time with the pilots of what to expect. And I'm not talking the day of, I'm talking about like going through the training itself and having an understanding of what to expect. But then my first IFR mission to also be flying up front at that particular time, so that there was the ability to, see the artificial horizon, and there was the ability to see that all the instruments are in the green and that everything's appropriate. And even when I did have some of that spatial disorientation and feeling like I was going in a direction I wasn't, to have that reference of the instruments to be able to like ground me and bring me back to that point, I think was something that was, hugely beneficial, because it can be a very overwhelming experience if you don't know what to expect. And I like to call it magic, right? Like you go into the clouds and suddenly you end up at this location that you're supposed to be, and poof, there comes the runway. It's like, it comes out of nowhere. But
Expectation management is very important. The crew needs to know what to expect. And so the pilot briefing is important. The departure briefing is important. En route briefing, updates, approach briefing is very, very important. And when you're flying a multi-crewed cockpit with 2 pilots, your approach briefing is structured a certain way. When you're taking your instrument check ride, Matt, your approach briefing is built for another pilot. They know what you're talking about. But when I'm interviewing for a position for an IFR pilot, during the interview, one of my questions is, hey, we're headed into this airport. Give me an approach briefing as if I were a med crew member. And it really, they don't know how to do it. They don't know what is important. They don't know what I said. Tell me what to expect. What's going to happen with the aircraft? Do you want me looking for anything outside the window? If so, tell me what to look for. Describe the approach lighting system in non-pilot speak. And that is a challenge. And I think that's something that to be able to give a med crew member a good approach briefing to where they feel as like valued, and they feel like, man, I'm a critical part of this, I think is really, really important. And so now the med crew member goes, wow, okay, now I know what to look for. Now I know about when this is going to happen. I know what to expect, because expectations also help identify red flags. If you do not give the med crew any expectations, they don't even know when to call you out. Hey, Dean, you said we should have seen some lights by now, but I'm not seeing any lights. Okay, thank you for telling me that.
Yeah.
Hey, you said I was supposed to keep the blue up top and the brown down below on the attitude indicator, but it's not like that right now. Thank you for pointing out. Right, those expectations are extremely important, because the more you have, the more you know when something is not correct, and med crew members are valuable in providing that information for us.
yeah, I think that's a really good point. I like to have that conversation. I think that's one of the benefits that I feel very fortunate with all the pilots that I've flown with, that we have that communication ahead of time. And we're having those briefs. Like, I like being part of an IFR program for the simple fact that we can plan for that from the beginning, and we don't have to end up being surprised, and that we can, facilitate safe transport in IFR conditions from start to finish, and that our pilots are often planning on that. So that's part of our brief in the morning, and we already have half of that battle out of the way before we're even getting started with the day. And to me, that's very comforting as a medical crew member to know that, my pilot's already planning for not just plan A and B, but, D, C, and E as well.
Mm. So Matt, would you say that flying single pilot IFR, and when you're communicating to the med crew, even at morning briefing, and then, 6 hours goes by and all of a sudden now that flight comes in, right? So you were thinking, maybe we're not going to do one. And you're like, ugh. So now that comes in, you guys obviously have your time limits for the shift, but maybe you can squeeze this one in, right? So how do you communicate that to the crew and earn their trust, and vice versa? Like, how do you communicate that hey, this is safe to do? Yes, it's going to be IFR. We talked about this morning. A little bit of time's gone by. So how do you really get that out to the med crews that, like, there might be a small time constraint, but we can do it safely, but these are the conditions, this is what to expect? How do you do that? And how can you portray that to the med crew to where they know that, hey, you're not doing it just because, but you're doing it because we can accomplish this safely?
Yeah. We're not just doing it to do it or go play in the cloud, so to speak. I think you really answered your own question there in a very nice way, almost a pilot way, and you communicate open and honest communication, closed loop feedback that, hey, it's not the beginning of the shift, and it's, second half of the shift, it may take a little longer. Again, it's apples and oranges depending on the program. Some programs fly longer IFR depending on the airframe that we have. Again, our typical IFR leg is going to be around a circular highway belt system here in the greater Cincinnati area, where it's going to be an hour or less, as there's fuel requirements that's going to come into play. But I think as long as you have that open, honest feedback that, hey, we can do this and we can do this safely, and the algorithm predicts that I'm going to have the time, and I think based on my training and experience, I'm going to have the time. And if we have a duty time issue, this is how we would handle that. And I want to make sure they're comfortable with that. But before that even happens, and all programs are different, but this is one of the many things I love about what we do at Metro is we will do flight crew IFR orientation flights. We will see a day that is absolutely, it's the kind of day that just makes guys like Gene and I giddy. We look and we're like, this is perfect helicopter IFR, soft IFR. And this would be a great day to get in some layers and introduce a med crew member to some light IFR where maybe they're going in and out of it before we go higher. We're in solid, and maybe we can get a block altitude if ATC is nice to us and we can expose them to that. So we'll make sure they have that experience going into it before they're flying an actual patient flight. Now, we don't always have that luxury with the physicians because there's so many of them, and they fly less frequently than the nurses. They may fly 1 or 2 shifts a week, where the nurses may be 4 or 5, depending on overtime. But we will do ground training with those physicians and show videos and lectures so that they know what to expect.
Do you think there's any value? And this was kind of brought up at our base because we just started doing IFR within the last year or so. Do you think there's any value on when you guys go to your recurrent trainings every 6 months? Do you think there's value of bringing a senior med crew member or somebody to the training that you guys are in to just see what you guys encounter when you go through the sim? Anything like that?
I suppose anything, if it's done correctly, could have some value. I don't know how much value. I know one of the things that we've done is we've captured video from various sim sessions, level D sim sessions, so that you can show med crew members what this looks like. Maybe even if it's non-IFR, what an engine failure looks like climbing off of a hospital rooftop. I think there's a lot of value in exposing them to that. Is that going to completely inoculate them from any fears or stress? I seriously doubt that, but I do believe that it has some value.
I know that was something that some of our upper management had discussed about, like, just exposure to just kind of really understand the stressors that you guys are put through when you go through the training and the things. Like you said, even if we're not there physically, but having video to see the procedure happen, it's done in the safety of a sim, but just to be able to see the procedures, the things, and the radio calls and everything you have to do, especially when you're one pilot IFR, and if you're on the patient leg, you're by yourself up front. So I think that it would be really great to see maybe more training, even just exposure to some of those things. So that way, like you said, it's not going to completely dispel that fear, but maybe it's an awareness from a med crew to be like, all right, this is what the pilot's experiencing right now.
Yeah.
And if there's anything I can do that I'm in the back, like, hey, we got to eyes out, we've got to be on the lookout, to just something, just so that way it's an awareness on both levels. So that way we kind of have a more of understanding of what the pressures are that you're feeling.
Yeah. I think if nothing else, Blake, I mean, also just the understanding of the increased workload that pilots have to go through, especially doing single pilot IFR and all the things that are happening up front. I don't think that most med crew members have a true understanding of, what that workload difference is and that process flow for all of you guys. And it really like hones in the importance of having those sterile cockpit times to be able to allow you guys to focus on doing what you need to do. And I think that, even if nothing else, at least the simulations or, having to be part of, sitting through that process, I think can bring a different level of understanding for most of the med crews out there.
And that's where those IFR crew orientation flights are worth their weight in gold, literally, because the pilot's getting some cloud time, they're getting some experience, they're getting some reps and some iterations in. And then they can even switch if they go from one hospital to the other and close out the IFR flight plan. In my case, I can then let the nurse sit in the back and the physician maybe sit up front so that they can get an appreciation for that workload. But yeah, for those programs that maybe don't have that opportunity to just go fly IFR without a patient on a nice IFR flyable day, then maybe something, where they're viewing some simulator videos or perhaps sitting in the back for some time or something like that.
I'm curious, talking through all this and some of the decision making that you guys are going through. Obviously, this is very, pilot focused with the decision process of accepting and carrying out an IFR flight mission. At what point are you guys typically getting your med crew's involvement in this process? And the reason I say that is, to paint kind of a picture for you. Have certainly heard of or been involved in some situations in the past where, the flight is accepted and we're dispatched, but it's IFR and we're going point to point, so airport to airport. And then there has to be that intermediate ambulance transport then to get to the hospital to then be able to load the patient up. But that may not have always been what's in the best interest of that patient. So at what point are you guys kind of like having that back and forth discussion to be able to figure out like, okay, yes, I say we can do this flight safely IFR. When does that next piece of the puzzle come in, and what does that conversation look like for you guys with your med crews?
Thank you to our sponsor, Precision Aviation Group. Mission-critical operators and fleet managers rely on Precision Aviation Group as a worldwide leading rotor and fixed-wing MRO provider. PAG provides tip-to-tail solutions in 4 MRO segments: avionics, components, engines, and manufacturing DER services. A single point of contact gives you access to over 150 million in inventory globally, 24/7. Just call 800-537-2778. Precision Aviation Group. Others sell parts. We sell support.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it all depends on the scenario. If it's always going to come up in a briefing what the weather forecast is for the day, what our capabilities are, what hospitals have approaches to the hospitals, which our med crews are veterans as well. They know if we're going to a certain hospital, it's going to have to be to the airport or whatever. But nevertheless, when the flight request comes in, the pilot first needs to. Fortunately, all our flight requests come to the whole crew, so everyone knows when there's a flight request. And usually the crews will just poke their heads out of the room or wherever we're at and say, "Hey, we got a flight to XYZ. It's IFR. I got to check a couple things to see what some of our limitations might be." But the med crew has to be brought in right away for buy-in and for, like you said, Mike, patient condition. And so at that time, the med crew may be doing their own homework on the condition of the patient. Let's really see what is going to be best for this patient, because it's not always just the IFR work or hey, we got to go here. There is going to be a ground leg. Are you guys okay with this? And they just have to be told all the facts of the case. Here's the limitations. Here's what we can do. You guys good? And then you need some sort of acceptance and buy-in from the med crew. We do that a lot with refueling. And so we'll say, hey, we are going to need fuel on this transport. Do you want fuel with the patient on board, or do you want to wait, or do you want to get fuel first, then get to the patient? And we let them make that decision for us, kind of said, hey, we'd rather get to the patient first because we are no kidding the highest level of care they have right now. Or no, they're in the ER. They have surgeons attending to them. We're fine. Let's go get our fuel. And then the patient can delay a few minutes based on those needs. And so the same works for IFR. We actually have a pretty significant runway closure going on for the next 6 months at one of our big airports. And it really changes the ground leg very, very significantly. And so this is an example of if we have to go IFR, we're going to have to do upwards of several, a long ground leg. And we got to get buy-in from the med crew too. And then the med crew has to talk to the comm center has to talk to the customer, to the hospital, and say, hey, this is the challenges we're facing. And then at the end of the day, the sending or requesting facility kind of has to say, okay, yep, we're good with that. Patient's good with that, or whatever the case may be. And we all go. But the challenge is, like you said, getting everyone involved, getting everyone to buy in, understanding expectation management. So there's no surprises.
So I think, or in the area that I'm at is probably pretty similar to where you're at, Matt, as far as, the length of our IFR or our VFR legs. And, with some of those, I think you have to take into account, like, is it what's right for the patient to be moved, first to the ER, from the ER bed to the aircraft stretcher on top of an ambulance litter into an ambulance, travel 10 minutes down the roadway, back into a helicopter again, do the liftoff procedures, add on, 10 or 15 minutes for the IFR legs of things to be able to get back to the other side, another ambulance transport on the other side if you don't have an approach built into that end place. Like, all of those factors come into play. And it's like, is that really what's best for the patient? And I think that, I feel very comfortable and enjoy flying IFR and like to utilize that option, but it's still at some point may not always be the best option for our patients, depending on what's going on in location.
Yeah, Mike, you're spot on. And I'm lucky enough, the way our system is set up, there are no ground legs involved unless there's been a missed approach executed and we go to a local airport and then the patient's retrieved. But you have to have those open communication sessions. And as Gene alluded to, the buy-in, it's where you look at the situation and you look at how far away that facility is. And as you pointed out yourself, the extra 15, 20 minutes of leg time, IFR, and the time to get the clearance and get out of there, you have to wonder, are you really justifying this, or is there justice for the patient here? Is it the best interest of the patient, as you said? So that's where you go to the med crew and you say, hey, this is very doable, safe IFR. However, we're looking at some extended time because of X, Y, Z. And then I don't want to know about the patient. I'm not supposed to know, of course, but, find out, is this a scoop and go, or is this a stay? And, someone 4 or 5 drips, are you going to be there for a while? And then, how does that going to be impacted by the future weather forecasts and my IFR planning and so forth? So you have to ask that hard question: is this even, is this in the patient's best interest?
I think that we should be able to, I feel like those conversations more often than not do happen. But I think as this service provider, that whoever is requesting the air transport, I feel that if that is the case, we should be able to explain that to that requester and allow them to make the decision on what's going to be best for that patient, right? Because obviously in the air transport world, our biggest selling feature is time, but also that the other aspect too is there's this other higher level of clinical care and things that the patient may need, right? So it's a balance of both. But really, at the end of the day, our sole mission should be what's best for the patient. And as much as I like to fly as anybody else and maybe go do this cool IFR flight, and it would be great, but if we are extending that time frame from that patient needing that definitive care, I think we shouldn't be shamed in having those conversations, and at least give the requester that information, right? And allow the physicians to maybe talk and say, we can do it, but because of this weather, it's going to take us what would normally be a 30-minute flight could be over an hour.
That's right.
And I feel like we should be able to give somebody that information. Like you said, we don't know everything about the patient, but like if we know they're on multiple drips and it's going to be an increased bedside time, we should be able to give them that information and allow them to make the decision on what's best for the patient. That, you know what, in the grand scheme of things, if it's going to extend that patient's time out from the tertiary care to the definitive care, then maybe the other mode is a ground transport, because while it sounds cool to get them there by helicopter, the time frame could be extended. I think from the pilot's perspective and the med crew's perspective, we should be allowed to have that conversation, give them that info and say, hey, here's where we're at. How do you want to proceed?
But I think that's been kind of a transition, though, because, there have been situations, and I think that's where some of the improvement in CRM has come down the lines. But, it was just, well, yes, the flight is accepted because we can do this IFR, but there was no other consideration that was taken into place. And I think that I'm hoping that we're kind of moving in that direction where that's only one piece of the puzzle of the best way to move that particular patient. And then we're taking into account some of those other factors as well. So I'm glad to hear that those are conversations and directions that you guys are going at your organizations.
It's challenging. It can be a slippery slope, but everyone has to have the adult conversation about it and be willing to ask the hard questions. This is complicated business. And with great privilege comes great responsibility. And some of that responsibility is having those hard conversations, even when the flight request comes in. And so it becomes quite challenging because egos are involved, people's decisions are involved. Sometimes the business aspect is involved. Like, are you really suggesting we turn down this flight? Because we won't get any revenue from a ground transport. And that becomes a very sensitive situation. And it is challenging. And it becomes a customer service nightmare for our customer service managers or our area managers that deal with the hospitals. They've got to be involved with the conversation. They have to be educated. They have to be able to explain, why did it change at the last minute? I could accept a flight VFR, land on the sending helipad. I'm waiting, and all of a sudden the weather goes to garbage. And now I've got to file an IFR flight plan just to get out of there. And then I'm another half hour delayed getting to the receiving. And all that happens in real time, very, very quick. And now the sending hospital says, why did you take an hour and 10 minutes to get our patient that we could have done by ground in 40? And after the fact, it's a very sensitive, people have to be talented in how they have those conversations, and they have to be tactful, professional, and say, these are the limitations of what's going on. And everyone out here is trying to do our best. We're not just fly-by-night organization, just winging it. But it's tough. And sometimes there's protocols that require really, really quick transport, but then the pilot's not supposed to know anything about the patient. And so they accept it, IFR. And then the hospital goes, that's not in the protocol. We needed them there within X amount of minutes. And now you guys took it way too long.
Right.
So that becomes very sensitive as well. At what point do we tell the pilot this falls under XYZ protocol? Now, it's hard. It's a varsity game.
Yeah. And I think, Gene, that leads really into this next topic that I feel is near and dear, and I take very seriously, is this aspect and this pressure to fly, right? To get these missions and get these patients where they need to go. So Matt, when it comes to this pressure to fly, right? So we know we got to get this patient. We might be their last hope, right? With that pressure to fly, and for you guys not necessarily knowing the patient's exact condition, but taking everything that we've talked about today, how are we doing as this industry with this pressure to fly? Is it like how much of it is self-induced, or how much of it is truly there's that excess pressure to just get these flights done? Like how are we doing as an industry in handling and mitigating this pressure to fly?
Wow, that's an open question. I think we could spend an entire podcast on that. Yeah, I think overall, that it's one of the cardinal rules, if you will, that med crew know to avoid pressuring the pilot at all costs. And I can honestly say, I mean, in 15 years of this game, I don't ever recall any intentional pressure. I think you're right. I think we put pressure on ourselves sometimes, our type of personalities, and we want to perform, we want to do good. But that's where you have to condition yourself, and you have to watch the type of mindset that you have. My background, Gene's background, we both, albeit different, we come from servant roles. And in this game, there's a 135 certificate hanging in every office of every air medical base that's operating under 135, of course. It has to be hanging in there. It's one of the things that's when you're audited, they make sure is there. So it's that air carrier certificate that I'm talking about. It's no different than Delta or United or any of them. We're air carriers. I know that our helicopters have all these fancy life-saving names and all these pretty paint schemes and all this marketing stuff, and I get that. But at the end of the day, we're commercial operators. So we have to be professional and guard ourselves against those pressures that we sometimes put on ourselves. And sometimes those pressures are very insidious. I know for myself and many pilots I've talked to over the years, and it's completely innocent, but you'll be in the pilot office, you're taking a good look at weather, you're determining, if it's not VFR, is this an IFR capable, flight? And now all of a sudden you've got a nurse and maybe a doc, and then a ride along new doc or a new nurse or something. All of a sudden they're all huddled up there at your office door and they're just looking at you. Are they trying to pressure you? Absolutely not. Does that create pressure for some people? It does. Yeah. So there's, again, the gamut of insidious pressures and things that come up could be an entire podcast in and of itself, I think.
Yeah. So how do we mitigate that? Like how can we be honest adults? And like you said, Gene, we got to be at a varsity level, right? And we got to do this. But how can we mitigate this pressure, or the self-imposed, right? So how do we mitigate those, but also that we're still viable? Like we have a resource that's incredibly useful, but how do we kind of handle at a professional level these inherent or these self-induced kind of pressures to fly?
Yeah. So I'm going to just touch on a couple key things real quick. The first one is I do a lot of mentoring for like transitioning military members that are trying to get into the commercial flying world or the civilian flying world. And I straight up tell them there will be pressure to fly. I think Matt was right. I think as an industry, we do a pretty good job. No one's pressuring you to do something illegal or unsafe. I think we've really kind of come beyond that. In the early 70s, pilots got paid by the transport. Talk about pressure to fly. If you wanted to eat, you had to accept the flight. We've really come a long way, I think. But there is still pressure to fly. I don't call it pressure to fly. I call it pressure to do your job. We have a very clear set of rules of what we can and can't do. And so, yes, you will be pressured to fly by the rules. And if the rules allow you to do an instrument approach down to a quarter mile, I will expect you to do that. There's not a whole lot of room for these, I'm padding this, I'm going to put a safety margin. I mean, there is a time and a place for that. But at the end of the day, professional pilots are expected to fly by the rules. I think it's a very cultural thing. Your company's culture, your organizational culture has to be all on the same page, right? You have to almost celebrate folks' courage to decline, right? And that has to be celebrated. You can't necessarily pat people on the back for getting the really hard missions done. Great job, because now people do feel self-imposed pressure. Oh, wow, that person just got a spot award or a buck or a safety dollar, or because they did a challenging mission. I'm not sure I would have accepted that. That's a strange award system,
Right.
But almost celebrate the declinations, right? Not to the point that it hurts the business, because I don't want to talk business here. But you do have to have a very, very healthy culture. Now, how do you foster that? Well, you have to be, like you said, adults when you talk about it, and you have to be curious, not judgmental. So if I have a pilot decline a flight and I'm not in the cockpit, I wasn't there, and so I may gather some information going, you know what, everything I'm seeing, I probably would have accepted. So let me ask this, but how do I ask this question tactfully and find out, what were you seeing that I did not see? Why did you accept? You can't go into it like, why did you accept it? Why did you decline this flight? You should have gone. Absolutely not, because I don't have all the facts. I don't know all of the items that we've talked about this entire podcast. I don't know the fatigue level of the crew. I don't know conversations that were had all the way up to that declination. But I might say, hey, could you give me and it's after the fact, it's after the heat of the moment, the flight's already declined. Maybe it's the next day. And you say, hey, buddy, I saw you decline the flight yesterday for XYZ. Could you please give me a little bit of more information on it? I really just want to know, maybe from an educational position, maybe some training is needed, or maybe I'm just missing something on the forecast or whatever. And if you go into it very non-offensively and you're just unarmed, you're not in a defensive posture, and you make them feel very valued, 99% of the time, they'll tell you exactly why they decline. And 99% of the time, it's a valid declination. And you say, great job. I'm glad that you saw that. I missed that in the NOTAMs, or I missed that in the weather report, or I had no idea your crew had just come off 17 traumas that morning. Like, good job. And then you celebrate that declination when it's valid. And then that empowers them. It builds trust, and it fosters a very healthy culture in the organization.
Thank you to our sponsor, Spectrum AeroMed. Spectrum AeroMed is your trusted partner in air medical solutions. Experience safety and innovation with their customized interiors, designed for both rotor and fixed-wing aircraft. Elevate your patient care with Spectrum AeroMed. For more information, visit spectrum-aeromed.com.
I'll give you one quick example that we as a assistant chief pilot, we pull aviation manager on call duties. And so we're the manager on call for the whole company, after hours. So midnight, somebody has a high risk assessment or aircraft has to divert, whatever the case may be, they get me on the phone, wake me up, and we have to kind of do that from a manager's perspective. I had one flight one night where the risk assessment, if the risk assessment score gets into a certain number, you have to call the manager on call to help mitigate the risk. And so this pilot calls me up, it was an airplane guy, and I said, okay, read me through your risk assessment, tell me what's going on. So he's reading all the things. He said, I've been with the company less than a year. I have less than 100 hours in this aircraft. I've got moderate turbulence, moderate icing. It's our 5th call of the day. I'm on my 7th shift, XY, all that down the thing. And I'm like, thank God for our risk assessment process. Right. And I said, okay. And he said, well, what should I do? I said, well, can you change any of those items?
Right.
Can we mitigate any of this? No. I said, then decline the flight. And he said, I can do that? I said, yes, absolutely. I said, either take a time. I said, how tired are you right now on a scale of 1 to 10? Like, if you put the phone down and got into a dark room, how quickly would you fall asleep? He said, well, I'm probably a 7. I was like, there you go. You just quantified your fatigue. I said, dude, there is no pressure for you to take this flight. He goes, but we have 8 flights stacked up on the board, and I'm the only fixed wing in service right now. I said, so? That's not your problem. That's unfortunate, but it's not your problem. And then I said, what do you want the headlines to read tomorrow morning? And he was like, okay. I said, do not use the words, I'll give it a try. Do not use the words, I think I can make it. I said, those are not in our vocabulary when it comes to this. I said, we can't change anything on your risk assessment. Take a timeout right now, 4-hour rest, and then call the comm center when you're back in service, or just decline the flight. Right. And he, over the phone, he said, I have never had a manager tell me that I could do that before. And he was new to our company. I'm not saying that, this was, he said, I said, he actually was very, very grateful. I said, this is the way it has to be. And I will empower you every opportunity and celebrate your declination. I'm sorry that the patient's not going to get transported the way they want to be, but that we have to do this and we have to foster this environment. Otherwise, you won't even be here tomorrow to fly another transport. So, or the potential exists. One, maybe you quit, maybe you go to a different operator, or maybe, God forbid an accident happens or whatever the case, but we have to be very, very mature about how we do this. There's no getting around it.
That's also where I applaud you guys in bringing it from the top down and setting that expectation. And I think that's where the process flow worked, right? Like, they identified an issue with the risk assessment tool. They called the administrator and called to try to fix whatever that problem was. There wasn't any mitigation that was able to happen at that particular time. And the decision is easy at that point. You have the numbers to validate everything that's happening in front of you. And I think that, when that process is followed, like this process flow worked. And I applaud you guys from, taking that in and making that a standard within, the company and going down that route. I think some of the other things that kind of tailor onto what you're talking about is just that ability to have that secondary conversation with another pilot. A lot of your larger organizations having that OCC capability and being able to have that conversation. Hey, are you seeing what I'm seeing? Does this look the same to you on your radar? Do you think this is something, and have that back and forth. I fly at a small mom and pop shop. So we, only have 2 aircraft in service at a time, but when we do have those flight requests, our pilots are still having that conversation. If they're both available, they're both having that conversation about whether or not that flight should be accepted or not, and making that decision collectively so that it's not solely on that one person to make that decision. I think that's something that also can kind of help work through that process for people.
I heard this kind of saying the other day that, for organizations, safety is more than just placards and cards and reporting. It's got to be adopted, at all levels. And, you have such a vast experience for, being an evaluator for the FAA, all your experience in HEMS. How do you get that to when you're training pilots and you're bringing in somebody new? How do you communicate that to them that, like Gene said, it's okay. Like, we can celebrate that declination. Like, how do you get that message to them without them feeling like, ooh, I have to do this and we have to get every flight and capture everything?
Yeah, it's pretty simple. I think a lot of it's been talked about. They're not going to get any calls from us. I can't imagine our company that ever happening at all. But aviation often becomes a way of life. I mean, you have a cool trade, right? You have a cool job, and people at Thanksgiving, they don't really want to know what's going on with the uncle that's the accountant, right? No offense to my accountant friend. They want to talk, to the pilot, hey, what's new, what's exciting, et cetera. But also safety, my point is safety has to become a way of life. And you have to continually push yourself and challenge yourself to make sure you're doing it the right way. And Gene mentioned this, you have to mentor these pilots. We have, with the advent of FlightAware and all these other apps, when I mentor a new pilot, it's been a few years here at our program, thankfully not much turnover, but there was a time there where I was mentoring several pilots over a several year period. And the nice thing with, FlightAware is I had it set, I knew exactly when the aircraft lifted and when the aircraft landed. And once I gave them time to get shut down, knew everything should be shut down and good to go, I would immediately give them a call. And if they could talk, they would answer the phone. And we would talk about that flight, that leg, how everything went. Was it what they expected? What went right? What went wrong? I'm also big on journaling. So I would have them and they would give that to me at the end of their IOE, their initial operating experience. We would talk about every flight, and I would want them to write just a few words. It doesn't need to be pages upon pages, but talk about what went right with that flight, what went wrong, and how we can make sure it goes better next time. So those are some of the ways that I would do that.
And I'll leave this to either Eugene or Matt. When pilots that are military trained or come from the military background and they've spent many years, and then they come into the civilian role and doing HEMS, do you find that there's an easier or harder transition on taking these flights or how to make these decisions? Do you feel that there's anything that makes it harder, or any differences that you see talking about pressures to fly and how it relates from non-military to civilian world? It's still a public service, it's still a necessary service for patients, but do you find that there's any ways on how you help pilots that were from military coming into civilian world and making these decisions to accept flights?
Yeah, it's definitely something that has to be addressed or pointed out. In the military, it's life, limb, or eyesight. We're going, and we will risk 5 to save 1. That is absolutely great. And when you're working under Title 10 of the federal code, you can do stuff that, it is what it is. And so for someone who's coming out of the military, potentially just have to make them aware of it. And it's an education process. There is a paradigm shift, and you have to be quite serious about it. I wrote an article a few years ago entitled, "We Aren't Saving Lives Anymore." And it was under the military to civilian transition column. So it was geared toward military professionals coming into the commercial world. And it's a resetting or a recaging of the gyro to change that paradigm. Hey, people are going to die. That's just the nature of the business. They're going to die in the back of your helicopter. They're going to die on the highway because you didn't get there. And you cannot beat yourself up about it. It's not your fault. And you just have to continue to kind of just enforce that concept. Your job, our job as an air ambulance pilot, is to move the helicopter safely from point A to point B, safely and legally. If we can't do that, someone else's emergency is not your emergency. They are having the worst day of their life potentially, but that's we can't factor that in. That's just not the way it is. And so, it has to be addressed. It has to be reinforced. Sometimes very gung-ho military veterans, you do have to kind of remind them on a more regular basis, just kind of keep them reined in and just say, look, we're not. And I think med crew do a good job of keeping some of those folks in check sometimes. Honest and trust, good crews that have worked together. The med crew will be the first to speak up. Hey, are you sure that we should be accepting this? And so I think that's why there's a very good, that's the culture is important. We can't just call up a brigade commander and the brigade commander orders us to go. I've been in those situations where I was ordered to go fly, and we can't. We don't do that. The system is not built that way, and so it does bear discussing and training, and in that transition to remind anyone with the previous mindset of like, man, let's go save a life, pat each other on the back, the bar later. Nope, we're not doing that.
I think that really drives it home, just the importance of, the processes that are in place, as far as for you guys accepting a flight, not knowing anything about what's going on with the patient ahead of time, because that shouldn't factor in your decision of whether or not this is safe to do. And, I think it's also great to, if we do have to decline a flight, like I should never really know like what happened in that situation because we're declining it because it wasn't safe to take care of in that particular time. If there's other means to be able to make it happen, then that's great. But that weight of, what is occurring at that time is not a burden that should be put onto any of those crews. And I think that point, the discussion you were having really kind of drives that home. So appreciate you saying that.
Matt, do you have anything to tail into that?
No, I already covered that with my mantra about it's a commercial operation. Mission mentality won't be tolerated where we are. So it can really bite you in the butt.
It can. Well, guys, I think we've had an incredible discussion today. I mean, like you guys both said, we could do 3 or 4 separate podcasts on each individual topic. And then
what do your schedules look like for the next few weeks?
I know, right? But I sincerely hope that that you guys had a great time just kind of discussing this. I hope that you'll keep us in mind in the future. I would love to do another series of this in the future with another, even other topics, because without our pilots, we're just med crews sitting on the ground, and then, without the med crews, maybe you're just flying around, so, I mean, it really highlights how much cohesive training and all this stuff that it takes for us to work together to accomplish this mission. And I really appreciate you guys taking the time to talk with us today. And I hope our listeners can really, take away from, the title of this podcast, the pilot's perspective, the other things that you guys have to consider, that the stresses and all the things that you guys go through to help us help our patients, I think is truly valuable. So from career resource management, IFR, there's so many topics, but thank you, Matt and Gene, for giving us your perspective on this today. I've walked away from this today learning a few extra things that I hope to bring back and put back at our base into practice to make it safer and better.
Yeah, we really appreciate you guys coming on and joining us. I think these are some really important discussions, and while we may have just kind of scratched the surface of many of these topics, I think that, I'm appreciative that you guys are willing to have those conversations. And I think that more of these conversations need to happen on an everyday basis around every single one of our bases. So thank you guys for being willing to discuss all of that. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we'd love to have you back on again in the future.
Well, thank you guys. I absolutely agree. It's been great chatting with you, Matt, and Blake, Mike. I'd love to be back. Appreciate the invite.
Thanks, guys. It's been a lot of fun.
Absolutely has. Thank you.
All right. Well, I think that wraps up this episode of the Valor Flight Crew podcast. I just want to say thank you to all our guests and our listeners out there for your support of the Vertical Helicast platform and this Valor Flight Crew podcast. So thanks so much, guys, and we'll catch you on the next episode.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Valor Flight Crew podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe to hear more stories that promote the personnel and equipment behind the missions in public safety aviation. Lastly, stand by for a message from our sponsors.
Thank you to our sponsor, Precision Aviation Group. Mission-critical operators and fleet managers rely on Precision Aviation Group as a worldwide leading rotor and fixed-wing MRO provider. PAG provides tip-to-tail solutions in 4 MRO segments: avionics, components, engines, and manufacturing DER services. A single point of contact gives you access to over 150 million in inventory globally, 24/7. Just call 800-537-2778. Precision Aviation Group. Others sell parts. We sell support.
Thank you to our sponsor, Spectrum Aeromed. Spectrum Aeromed is your trusted partner in aeromedical solutions. Experience safety and innovation with their customized interiors, designed for both rotor and fixed-wing aircraft. Elevate your patient care with Spectrum Aeromed. For more information, visit spectrum-aeromed.com. Stay ahead of the mission with Vertical Valor Magazine, the only publication dedicated exclusively to the military and public safety sectors of the rotorcraft industry. The Valor team travels around the globe to bring you stories from the rotorcraft industry's first responders, with a special focus on the knowledge and technology that furthers their missions. Learn more at verticalmag.com/valor.
Well, that wraps up another great episode of the Valor Flight Crew podcast. Today, we took a deep dive into the pilot-medical crew relationship and the critical role communication, teamwork, and training play in safe, successful air medical operations. A huge thank you to Gene Reynolds and Matt Johnson for joining us and sharing their perspectives from the cockpit, giving us all a better understanding of the challenges they face and how we, as a team, can support one another to keep our crews and patients safe. From managing weights and equipment to respecting the sterile cockpit rules and to preparing those challenging IFR missions, it's clear that success in this field comes down to collaboration, trust, and constant readiness. To all our listeners, thanks for joining us for this conversation and your continued support of the Vertical Helicast platform. Whether you're part of a flight crew or just passionate about the world of air medical transport, we hope you found some takeaways to apply on your next shift. And if you haven't already, head over to www.echoflightcrew.org to learn more about the teams and programs that support this community, and be sure to follow the podcast so you don't miss upcoming episodes. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time on the Valor Flight Crew podcast, where we continue to highlight the people and stories that make this industry great.